Hi, and welcome to the Humanities and Social Science Lecture Series and Pulitzer Center Campus Consortium podcast. I'm your host, Professor Michelle Stonis from the History Department at GCC, and today we have a distinguished guest with us from the Pulitzer Center, who's also claimed in her own right in many different ways, Dr. Tara Pixley. Before we go too deep into your story, I did want to talk a little bit kind of about your biography and some of your intersections. Looking at your work, your article, Immersed in Oil, which you published not only through the Pulitzer Center, but with High County Times, you're really intentional in your biographies that I've seen of talking about your different social locations. Can you just share why that's important to you to share those right off the bat?
Absolutely. And I also just want to thank you so much for having me here today. And thank you to the Pulitzer Center and Glendale Community College. This has been really great. So it's really important to me to signal and kind of, be honest about where I come from. Because being a journalist, a lot of the kind of traditional modes of thinking about journalism, there's a lack of transparency about the backgrounds, the people who are producing our news. And there's this idea that acknowledging who you are and where you come from limits your objectivity. And I think that it's actually the opposite of that we are able to be more accurate in our reporting when we're frank and honest with ourselves and our audiences and the communities we're working with about who we are as people and what we bring to this work. So any room I show up in, I am coming there as a child of immigrants. I'm coming there as a person who grew up working class, who grew up in the southeast part of the United States, who is queer, who is a young mother. All of those things are components of who makes me who I am. Mm-hmm. I can never extricate them from my person. And so being honest about who I am when I show up is a part of my practice as a journalist and a scholar and a human being.
That's great. And I know, too, one of the things that fascinated me about you and your work is that you do have these different intersections, right? Of you're an academic, you have PhD training from UCSD, and yet you're also an investigative journalist and this accomplished photographer, and you play guitar when you were 7. So you're kind of a woman of all trades. And so I'm kind of wondering, have you felt like you've had to show up differently in those spaces or like deny what people might think is your bias? Because we are who we are wherever we show up.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I think when I was starting out in journalism, prior to my doctoral education, I had less of an understanding of kind of, socio-political flows and things that impact us as people and kind of impact all of the ways that every industry works, right? So I was working in journalism and experiencing racism and misogyny and what we would call misogynoir. Mm-hmm. And I was feeling those things, but I didn't have the kind of language or the education at the time to put those things into words the way that I can, and to understand the historical trajectories that that would bring a newsroom full of journalists who are dedicated to, the pursuit of knowledge and social justice and all of these things, how that space could be so misogynistic and so racist. So to kind of circle back to your question, I do feel like I've had to navigate each of these spaces of academia and news media, and now I do a lot of advocacy work and working with nonprofits. So in each of these places, I'm always myself, but I do try to think about what is the most productive way that I can show up in these spaces? How do I connect with people where they are? And how do I learn as much as I can about how this space works and how people are connecting to it so that I can be a meaningful part of that kind of fabric. And I think it's also really important, to go back to what I was saying about being in newsrooms and prior to doing my PhD. Now that I have that language and that kind of framework to assess how these different flows of power and, socioeconomic, sociopolitical things are happening in these different spaces, I try to bring attention to them in ways that people can connect with in whatever space I'm in. And I'm not the only person doing that work. There's always tons of people who do that work. And hopefully we get the opportunity to collaborate in making that more apparent.
I love that you brought up learning, because we spoke before we went on camera. I'm here to learn from you, right? It's not a gotcha moment. Even as academics, right? We have different areas of specialty. We have different lived experiences. We have different social locations. And so I appreciate that you like open yourself up in that way so we can learn, right? Like, this is where I'm coming from and this is how I'm approaching this work. And that's why we do want multiple perspectives and multiple people doing it. There is no one hero that's going to solve the whole problem. So I really appreciate that perspective. And also, too, as speaking of learning, of intersectionality, just want to define it real quick for our viewers at home. So intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 in her thesis, but it's a term that has historical underpinnings. And what it simply means is that it's a theory that says when we look at how life works, or we look at people's lived experiences, we have places of privilege and places of oppression. And often our different social identities, right, those big categories like race, gender, class, sexual orientation, disability status, national origin, those intersect in a way that compound that oppression, right? And so misogynoir, which is a term that means, right, being Black and female, right? You're not just being discriminated against because you're Black, and you're not just being discriminated against because you're a woman. They're somehow mixed together in a way like they're not separated. They can't be. So thank you for that teachable moment.
Right, thank you.
Okay, let's lighten it up.
The specificity of your dates. This is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, historians. Historians were the kids that always asked why, and also like, did you know? Like, that's us. Like, kind of pesky. Lighten it up a little bit, and I'm curious to hear your answer. So when I heard your last name, Pixley, I was like, is that good branding, or is that really your name, right? Because photograph pixels. So I'm like, that'd be like if I'd be Wells Barnett was named like IWMF publisher. Like, it would make it easier on a test, right? Like, oh, it's this. So is that your given name?
That is indeed my family.
Win in the stars.
Yeah, and you might have heard of Pixley, California.
Yeah. Are you famous?
I'm not famous.
Are you royalty?
It's part of my like family in the UK. So we have this long history. I'm Jamaican, as I mentioned, but if you go back a couple times.
That's right. Colonization.
Yes, absolutely.
How did you find that out? Ancestry.com?
No, I have my father's side of my family, the Pixley side, was a little more well-resourced, and they actually had a connection to the kind of like family line, right? So
wow.
They actually had this knowledge of the Pixley name, and I think it goes back to the 1300s. I don't know. It's not really interesting, but
dropping dates for the historian. I see what you're doing. I'm on to you.
I've been trying to see if there's a family crest for a long time. So, if you want to help me in assessing that.
I'm not that interested in genealogy. I find it, maybe that's only because my family asked me to do it. I'm like, I don't work for free. But I think you have the opportunity to make one. Like, don't even look for one. You're an artist and a photographer. You make it.
That is a really empowering thing for you to say. Appreciate that, but I can't draw.
Well, we'll use AI. That's our next podcast.
What is the Pixley?
Join Dr. Tara Pixley as she makes her family crest live.
So I just coincidentally have the last name Pixley, or maybe it drew me to being a photographer. I don't know, but also ironically, my initials are TL Snap, SNAP, because I have 5 names. Jamaicans like to add on about.
Got it. TL Snap.
Yeah.
Is that your karaoke name? What is going on? And you come out with your guitar album. That's nice. It's interesting though, that kind of naturally segues into my next question, because we have all these different identities and experiences, right? And if you didn't tell me that, I wouldn't know. Like that you have 5 names, right? It's like Toni Morrison, the author, says like definitions belong to the definers. Like we get to show up in a space, right? Like, for example, I wear hearing aids. Like if I don't tell you and you don't see them, like I can be invisible in that space or that moment if I don't want to out myself in that way. And so can you speak to what that was like, as much as you would like to share, especially for our students who are watching, of, immigrant family, first-gen college student, like how did you end up in a PhD program? Like a young mom, like how did you navigate to get where you were going? Because as much as we joke, right, like it's written into the stars, like I wish my last name was like millionaire, right? And it's not, we still have that human agency, like we call that historical agency in history, of like we always have human free will. Like there is a whole other you that could have existed where you pivoted left and not right. Like you chose a different major or you moved to a different place. So how did you end up where you were? Like how'd you end up a PhD program?
So both of my parents were immigrants from Jamaica to the U.S. and my parents were not together when I was growing up, so I was just raised by a single mother. But they both valued education in large part because they didn't have access to it. My mother actually didn't even get to go to high school. She had to leave school at 13 to start working as a secretary, and she worked as a secretary for like almost 60 years and raised 5 children, mostly on her own. And education was so important to her because she loved it. She loved reading. She passed that on to me. And so even though she didn't have the opportunity to go to college and do those things, she was constantly, saying how important education is to your success. And even though she was an excellent admin assistant or executive assistant, and she actually trained several of the other executive assistants. She worked for the CFO of Bank of America years ago. Wow. And I remember growing up, I would hear her and her friends talking about how she was turned down for all raises and things like this. So even as she was training her colleagues, they were making more money than her. They were predominantly white women. And they said that the reason why that was the case is because she didn't have a bachelor's degree. Which, in retrospect, I don't think that was the reason, but I remember thinking, I'm going to get every bit of education I can so that I will be undeniable, so that no one can ever say the reason why I couldn't do this thing is because I wasn't educated enough. So I knew from a young age that I was going to, I didn't even understand what a PhD was. And when I got to my doctoral program, that was a really rude awakening because I really did not know I didn't understand that academia was its own industry. I understood myself as a journalist who was coming to get the most education, the terminal degree of a PhD so that I could begin to teach that. I didn't really know what it meant to be a scholar because there were no other PhDs in my family. Yeah. And of course now, 12 years later, I very much understand.
Well, that cultural knowledge too, right? Of like we walk into spaces, like we have students here, right? That they don't have a parent at home that can say like, hey, this is what office hours means, or this is why you need to read your syllabus, right? Like we take for granted the cultural capital we have, and then we find ourselves in spaces where we're needing help and support. How did you find it?
Absolutely. I found it very difficult, but part of being raised the way that I was, my father was a construction worker and contractor, and my mother, as I mentioned, was an admin assistant. So I would kind of move from being with my dad in Georgia, like rural Georgia, being in construction sites and talking to formerly incarcerated people, talking to people who also had not, gone very far in their education, and seeing how hard they worked, how intelligent they were, like all of the skills that they had, things that they were capable of doing, they're literally building the world that we live in. And just seeing how they interpreted the world and how they spoke to each other. And then sitting in a boardroom surrounded by,
I work in corporate America, so I'm like, I already know what that.
Yeah, so I'm like 10 years old doing my homework quietly in the back while, my mother is being the stenographer for a room full of some of the world's most powerful white male bankers and learning how to go to their parties, their Christmas parties and their mansions, right? And show up in this way and speak in a way that I could connect with them. So
code switch?
Yeah, so I learned to code switch very young. And the thing that I saw that was true no matter where we were is that you had to relate to people and connect with people, meeting them where they are. And you had to respect everyone. And then you really had to show up in a way that made you legible, right? So that code switching. But work ethic was always the thing that got people the furthest and got you the respect that you deserved regardless of education. And so I really, for me, it has just been working very hard and paying attention to the spaces I'm in, who is succeeding in these spaces, what are they doing to get there, and taking advantage of every opportunity. If a teacher, when I was younger, would say, why don't you apply for this thing? I would apply for it. It didn't matter if I was, scared or if I thought I couldn't do it. I always just followed the opportunities people were providing and constantly seeking those opportunities out myself. And I think that's how I got to where I am now, just working really hard and not turning down any offers of help.
Yeah, it's a great kind of lesson there, right? Of like, even if we don't have the cultural capital or what we think we need from those around us, mentors or family or parents, of like, take the lessons like of hard work, integrity, right? Like showing up and building something and having your name on it. Like you're doing that in just a different way. So maybe that segues more into your work, right? Your community activism. And I watched your Adobe Changemaker video several times and she was at family. I was like, look who that meeting. And one of the things you mentioned, it was like this really like poignant scene where you're kind of in the background of like what looks like to be a community meeting. And you're like, it's important for me to show up in these spaces and like be part of the work, not just, you know, the person that's taking a photo and selling it, right? Like you're in those spaces and someone coming alongside to help. And so how do you earn the trust, or how do you find that ability to, you know, you're asking people, right, about their health conditions, you're asking them about, you know, what's happening in their community, and they need to know that you're like a safe person that's on their side. So how do you build that rapport?
It's interesting that you're kind of signaling that community meeting, because that community meeting, that specific one, which was put on by Magali Sanchez Hall, who is a wonderful community activist in Wilmington. She does those community meetings to have conversations with folks in Wilmington about what's going on, what are they experiencing, and also to relay some of the information that she's getting from different areas. And so I went to that meeting and introduced myself to some of the folks there in my terrible Spanish, trying to connect. I was like, I'm going to introduce myself in Spanish and then I will return to English because I apologize.
I'm just glad to hear you're not great at everything. That makes me feel better.
I wish more than anything that I was a polyglot, but I'm sadly not. And at that meeting, one of the women there said, you know, so the part of why this is important for you to be here is that we see you keep showing up. And that was really meaningful to me, that, you know, that was something that she felt and witnessed and was willing to share. And that's really been my experience, that when you just keep showing up, people believe that you are actually there for them. Because unfortunately, with a lot of news media, there's some big story and then people come and they ask you a million questions and they're in your face and they're in your house, and then the story moves on. The people who keep returning to see, how are you doing? How are you feeling today? What does the rebuilding look like? What are the things you're still experiencing? And that's a part of doing long form storytelling, right? Like I didn't have the opportunity to do that when I was working as a staff photojournalist at a newspaper. I had to run from assignment to assignment, so I didn't get to connect with people on that level. So now, being able to do long form visual storytelling, I do get to feel like I build more trust. By showing up, but I think also just listening to people, not making assumptions, not thinking that I know anything about, you know, I can do all of my research and I have all the stats of the asthma rates in Wilmington and, you know, the cognitive decline in these particular schools. I can look at the maps and look at the data, but when I'm talking to a person, the only thing that matters is their story. What is their individual experience? What is their knowledge of this environmental injustice? And I just listen and learn. And I think listening to people is incredibly powerful. So that is how you earn trust.
Listening, it sounds like relationship building. It reminds me of a quote I show from the Virginia Historical Society. It's like a family search, like kind of like Ancestry.com commercial. I show my students about the Freedmen's Bureau. And the quote that I love, makes me tear up at the end every time, is like, people just want to matter. They just want to matter. They just want to know that they're seen and that they're heard and that they matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like you showing up, that's what that does, right? Like, I'm not here for the photo. I'm here for you. It's really powerful.
Also, so I think, you know, because ultimately I am there also for the photos,
right,
but communicating why the photos matter, right? Like I am taking images or making images in this space of you, of your community, of this landscape, because I want to be able to share the thing that you are sharing with me in a way that will resonate with people who cannot come to Wilmington, who have never seen or heard of this place. So that work of visual storytelling, I think, is really important because it just connects people and helps them understand and imagine, what is it like to live here? You can see the air in the image and how the levels of toxicity can physically witness it, right? And while you can't experience what it is to breathe that air in, if you've never been to Kern County or Wilmington, you can see it. And so it becomes legible for you in a way that I think someone just writing about it doesn't, right? And, not to knock writing is very important, but those things they should happen together, right? And that's how I think it becomes powerful and impacts people and educates them.
Yeah. And that's historical too, right? Like child labor in this country, Lewis Hine was a prolific photographer, right? And snuck into factories and took photographs, right? Of, kids, with fingers missing or, newsies or falling asleep on city steps. I think photography can speak to us in our humanity differently. Not that they're one's better than the other, but differently than words, because it can pique our emotion. Mm-hmm. And that can maybe stir us to moving to have empathy and then to action.
And you also have a better memory of it, like our relationship to the visual. We can hold on to an image in our mind more so than we can remember an entire 1,000-word article. You pick out little things that you recall, but an image in its entirety will stick with you for a long time.
Right. So I want to switch a little bit to, you mentioned Kern County, and that's about 2 hours away from Los Angeles. If you've ever kind of commuted anywhere on the 5, you've probably passed a place called Hinckley. And I was wondering if you could speak to Hinckley or maybe Kern County more generally of that. Kern County is where the majority of the United States food supply comes from. And yet it's one of the most polluted areas in terms of oil and very high cancer rates. Can you just, as much as you'd like to share, speak about why that should concern us?
Absolutely. And thank you.
Let's be depressed.
Thank you for bringing that up because I was frankly so shocked the first time I went to Kern County. I was expecting to go and photograph people who were being impacted by oil infrastructure because Kern County is one of the largest oil producers in the country. But what I saw and what I learned was this other side of it, that Kern County is also the largest producer of produce, of our fruit and vegetable supply. And you'll see this in my images, and I witnessed this with absolute shock, that there's active oil wells in the middle of carrot fields, grape vineyards. They're just kind of drilling for oil as all of this food is around them. And I was being taken around, and actually I meant to make this other point, that another reason why I've been able to get access to communities and build trust is that I work with activists and advocates who are already doing this work. And I share with them why I want to be there and why I think this matters. And they often help me, navigate those spaces, introduce me to people. So I just want to shout out those folks who do the work, bringing, storytellers into communities and making it possible for us to be there. And it was one such person, Cesar, who works in Kern County with an advocacy group that kind of goes around and helps community members learn about what is happening with oil infrastructure. They also give out testing kits so people can test their water and the air quality near their home. And he took me around kind of different parts of Kern County, the kind of rural outside of Bakersfield, like Vermont, and Arvin. And as he was showing me these wells, he was pointing out, oh, this one is leaking. And I could see actual oil on the ground by the carrots. So I said, is that normal? Is that supposed to happen? And he was telling me, no, that's not supposed to happen. And he called he called that leak in, but he said they're only required to come and check once a year. So, if a leak happens the day after the person has come to check, it's leaking for a year, unless someone like Cesar comes and sees it and calls it in. So, just thinking about that we're plundering the depths of our soil, bringing all of these things up to the surface in the same space where we are making our food. And, I'm no food scientist, but I don't think that that's good. I don't think that it is healthy. So we're ultimately exporting the toxicity of Kern County. The people who live there have to deal with that. They can't drink the water. The air quality is so terrible. The asthma rates are astronomical. As you mentioned, we have cancer clusters, very aggressive cancers. All of those things are happening. And then we're also exporting
Right.
this food that is being watered with this toxic water.
But that's why we should all care, right? We're all interconnected, right? Even though we might live in different states or different counties, right? It's like the food that's grown there is being shipped to your grocery store, right?
People don't know that, you have to really peel back that curtain and understand a lot more about the kind of flows of capital and produce and products across our country and across the world to see how we're all being impacted.
Sure. I know there's more conversations around food, like Food Inc. is coming out, like Super Size Me back in the day. But, there's some of us that maybe don't want to know. We don't know. We're so disconnected from where our food comes from, like, especially, right, the pastoral narrative of like, your beef came from here, and it really didn't. But also, too, there's an economic component to that, too, of like, can you afford the organic food that wasn't from, does it affect organic food as well?
I don't know I don't believe that any of the food there is probably labeled organic.
Yeah.
Because in order to be organic, you can't use certain pesticides. And I believe that one of the issues with the water in Kern County is actually the pesticide use. So they're kind of battling on a few different levels.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't be able to say for sure they have any organic.
Yeah, not to put you on the spot, but just thinking intersectionally, right, of like class too plays into that of like, can you afford, right? Like we live in a caste system, right? If you can't afford the healthy food that's being shipped to your community, or you live in a food desert, so you don't have choices between lots of different carrots. You have one choice.
Yeah, and that's at both, the supply and demand of that kind of chain, because the farm workers who are working in these environments, in the shadow of these oil derricks that are leaking, and then they're also in the hot sun, they're dealing with heat stroke because it's incredibly hot there. There's all of these different elements that these farm workers, they're not getting paid livable wages to essentially put their life on the line. So that's happening here on the supply side, where the big corporations that own these things and the oil companies that are making money off of this, they're all becoming millionaires, billionaires, while the people who are left to bear the brunt of their toxicity and, the kind of, health dangers and health risks, those people are not getting paid well enough to survive. And a lot of those farm workers are migrant farm workers. They might be undocumented workers, and we don't
uninsured, probably don't have medical,
right? And don't have the power, don't feel they have the power to speak back to these hierarchies of capitalistic power and corporate power.
It's really good. I know in your article, Immersed in Oil, you mentioned that Black and Brown communities bear the brunt disproportionately of this like environmental injustice and the health consequences. Can you speak to that, maybe particularly in Wilmington, that it seems like tends to follow particular people? Can you share?
Yeah, so there's actually a really interesting thing that happened called the Sorrell Report in the mid to late 80s, where I think it was Los Angeles, actually, the kind of city of LA was looking to place these undesirable land usage. They have a particular name for it, but it's essentially like landfills and things like oil wells, like things that are going to be disruptive to the environment. Like, where do they place those things? So they hired this consulting firm to do the Sorrell Report, Sorrell firm, to see where can we basically put this stuff that it will be fine. And the Sorrell Report, you can look it up online. It told them, well, communities that are working class, that are predominantly Black and Brown, communities that are extremely religious, those are the spaces that will not speak back to this undesirable land use. They don't have the time, they don't have the resources, and a lot of times they don't have the level of education. So that's choosing between, am I going to put this landfill in Santa Monica, where there will be, a lot of well-to-do people who have time on their hands to call and complain and just like see these impacts and to do the research and see the studies and all of these things, versus am I going to put that in Wilmington, which is predominantly, like 70% Latina communities, immigrant communities, with lower levels of education because of lower levels of access to privilege and resources. And those are the people who, if you're working 2 shifts to make sure your family can eat, if you're taking your child to the hospital over and over again and for asthma, even though those things it's because of the toxic environment you're living in, how do you have the time to try and fight big oil? So they actually did research to know that if we use these communities, they will be the least able to fight back against it. And you can see that there's no way for us to prove that other companies have used this, but there's a big uptick in environmental injustice in the placement of those undesirable land, the various forms of undesirable land usage that gets then played in communities of color and working class communities.
Right. It makes me think of the airline industry and airports of like down in Orange County. I'm in Long Beach in Newport Beach area. If you fly out of Orange County, John Wayne Airport, the ascent is so high. Have you ever been there? The ascent, it goes straight up, right? And people are like, why? Well, it's because they fly over Newport Beach, and all the people in Newport Beach fought back and said, we don't want the noise pollution or the air pollution. So you have this huge ascent so that they can avoid these very wealthy homes that are right on the coast. But then you go to LAX, right? And people have like Inglewood, they have SoFi Stadium, they have the Kia Forum, they're running shows all the time. It's loud, the light pollution, the traffic, the commuting, right? The jobs that are available. And then you have the airport right there. And it's like, just observing, you're like, why did this happen? And it's like, you have those answers. So
I've lived in the Burbank flight path for the last 6 years, and it's wild. You can see this just kind of fine black dust that's just always there. We have to constantly clean. And I moved outside of that flight path, and I don't have that anymore. So, I can't prove that. I'm not able to test this dust and talk to Burbank Airport about it. Many people, I'm sure, are doing that work, hopefully. But that's the kind of stuff that you live with every day. But how do you actually do anything about that? And something you asked about Erin Brockovich and the lawsuit that she brought against PG&E. One of the things that has been really frustrating to see is how difficult it is to bring a lawsuit against these various oil companies, in large part because they're allowed to keep the different ingredients of their fracking mixture and all of the pollutants that they use. They call them trade secrets. So they're legally protected from letting people know what those things are. So
the pollution is trade secrets.
Yeah. So the exact composition of what they're using to do, fracking, which is where you're using water and different chemicals at high pressures. They don't have to say what that is. So you can't say, I'm being impacted by this particular chemical, and they can say, well, we don't have to tell you if you're using that. And one of the things I hear from community members all the time is that, some cancer clusters, the problem with this is that you can have a community that is experiencing very high rates of extremely aggressive cancer. But if you can't tie it to a specific thing, it is happening because of this, even though logically, this is the thing that makes this community different, is the oil drilling that's happening around there. If you cannot scientifically tie it, it doesn't hold up in court. And the oil companies have been very successful at, kind of skirting any ability for people to really show that this is happening. But more and more studies are coming out. It's a University of Washington study that showed that air quality, poor air quality and increased, kind of proximity to that or exposure to that actually can impact people, from birth can impact your cognitive abilities and can also contribute to behavioral issues in children. Stanford studies showed that proximity to oil can actually cause preterm labor, stillbirth, all of these maternal mortality issues. So we're starting to see that more research is showing how dangerous this is, but we have to then make the connection between that kind of scholarly study and research that's happening in this one arena and actually allow the people who have been living that and knowing in their bodies and in their families and the people they've lost and the asthma they've lived with their whole lives. How do we connect that so that they can be vindicated?
Well, how do you prove your child has ADHD right, is caused by the fact you live by the nation's largest port or by an oil refinery, right?
And so the studies are showing that there's cognitive development issues and lung development issues. So children who are exposed to this, they will have lung problems their entire lives. They also will not be able to test it well. So then this becomes a long-term issue where they say, oh, the children in these schools around these areas aren't doing very well because, they're not smart enough. No, actually, they can't breathe. And so their brain is not getting the oxygen it needs to do well. So you're making it so that they will not advance academically, and you're limiting their life options just by the air pollution that you acknowledge is occurring.
It's a trade secret.
Yeah.
I think you've given us a lot to think about. I love how your work, it just intersects with so many disciplines, right? Like geography, women's studies, history, journalism, just like this advocacy that we need, right? We need the academic understanding, maybe to understand these reports, but we also need like the bodies on the ground who are able to share their story and to report the story or to make it visible. So thank you for doing that work. I really appreciate, you being out there, right? Being an Adobe change maker, I'm sure is like, woo, right? It's like, but you're putting in the hours, like in the hot sun, you're networking. There's probably a lot more that you do behind the scenes that we don't get to see, right? All of that work to get that one photograph. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. You're welcome. And I just want to say that really, I want to shout out the people who are out there every day, getting the community members to understand what is happening, walking from home to talk to them. There's so many incredible activists and community advocates, Magali, I mentioned, Nayeli Kobo. There's so many folks who are doing that work. And I am just honored and privileged to be able to walk alongside them and try to document what they are doing, because they're really leading this movement. And I'm just trying to tell the story of the work they're doing.
Awesome. Thanks for collaborating and working together. Thank you to the Glendale Foundation for supporting our collaboration with the Pulitzer Center. We appreciate their support. And thank you to Dr. Tara Pixley for being with us today. And we'll see you next time.